everybody. I welcome you all to today's lecture by Professor Amita Baviskar. A warm welcome to you, Professor Baviskar, and thank you so much for agreeing to do this talk for Dialogues. I shall begin with a few words about the speaker and then go on to talk very, very briefly about the contents of the book, and then hand over the mic to Professor Baviskar for the talk. So Amita Baviskar is a professor of environmental studies and sociology and anthropology. Her research and teaching address the cultural politics of environment and development in rural and urban India. She focuses on the role of social inequality and identities in natural resource conflicts. Currently, she is working on the politics of food and changing agrarian environments in Madhya Pradesh and studying the social experience of air pollution in Delhi. About her education, after studying economics and sociology at the University of Delhi, she received a PhD in development sociology from Cornell University. Besides working at the Department of Sociology, University of Delhi and the Institute of Economic Growth, Delhi, she has been a visiting scholar at several universities, including Stanford, Cornell, Yale, University of California at Berkeley, and the University of Cape Town. Her first book is In the Belly of the River, Tribal Conflicts over Development in the Narmada Valley. She's a prolific writer and has other books and articles, of course, to her credit. About the book, today's talk. Today's talk is based on Professor Baviskar's recently published book, Uncivil City, Ecology, Equity, and the Commons in Delhi. The book discusses changing notions of the commons and its rights of usage in the light of questions of class and social justice in the city of Delhi. The author raises interesting questions of who gets to use the city space and critiques ideas of bourgeois environmentalism that she argues has many flaws and has had a disastrous impact on the city's migrant population, the homeless and the poor. Questions of urban development and beautification, as well as those of fashionable environmentalism that really speaking represent the bourgeois outlook of life, have been brought into the light in a cohesive manner by Professor Baviskar in this fascinating work. The book examines the politics of environmentalism and the urban sociology of Delhi with the city's marginalized sections such as factory workers, construction workers, rickshaw pullers, and the like in the foreground. And that is what makes the book so intellectually stimulating to read and engage with. Once again, I welcome Professor Baviskar, and you may take over from here, Professor Baviskar. Thank you very much once again for joining us today on Dialogues.
Thank you, Professor Sengupta. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'm so sorry that I could not, due to the world we're living in right now, visit the IIT Gandhinagar campus. But I look forward to doing that somewhere later and continuing this conversation in person. But for now, let me just tell you something about my book. And most of my talk today is going to be about this book that came out early last year, which represents essays that I've written about Delhi over several years, in fact, more than a decade. And I'm hoping that that if I take you over the main arguments that I make in the book, then we can continue to have a conversation about the kinds of issues it raises and the similarities or otherwise that might exist between Delhi and the cities that you know and care about. So let me begin with an started thinking on the subject of cities and their ecology. I want to take you to sort of put your mind back and imagine Delhi on the morning of 30th January 1995, as the city was waking up to another misty winter day. And in the well-to-do neighborhood of Ashok Vihar in North Delhi, early risers were emerging from their warm homes for morning walks, bundled in woolen jackets, scarves, and caps to keep out the chill. Some of them had pet dogs straining at the leash. And as one of these gentlemen walked into the neighborhood park, the only open area in the locality, he saw a young man, thin, poorly clad, walking away with an empty bottle in his hand. Outraged, he caught hold of the man and called out to his neighbors. Someone phoned the police. Within minutes, a group of angry house owners and two police constables descended on the youth and they beat him to death. Now, this man was 18-year-old Dilip. He had come to Delhi to watch the Republic Day parade in the capital. He was staying with his uncle in a jhuggi or a shack along the railway tracks on the edge of Ashok Vihar. His uncle worked as a laborer in an industrial estate nearby. And like all other so-called planned industrial zones in Delhi, this one too had no provision for housing workers. Although the Jhuggi cluster had more than 10,000 households, it had only 3 public toilets, each one with 8 latrines. So in effect, each latrine, you can imagine, had to be shared between more than 2,000 persons at least once every day. So for most residents, any large open area under cover of dark became a place to defecate. And it was their use of the so-called park for this purpose that brought them up against the more affluent residents of Ashok Vihar, who paid then to have a wall constructed between the unsightly Jhuggi Basti and their own homes. But the wall was soon broken, not only by people looking for a place to defecate, but also to allow the traffic workers who lived in the Jhuggi Basti but walked across the railway tracks every day to cook and clean the homes and cars of the rich, to wash their clothes and mind their children. So Dilip's death was the culmination of a long-standing battle over a contested space that to one set of residents embodied their sense of gracious urban living, a place of trees and grass devoted to leisure, recreation, and doggy walks. And that to another set of residents was the only available space that could be used as a toilet. If Dilip had known this history of simmering conflict, he would probably have been more alert and wary. If he might have run away when challenged, and perhaps he would still be alive. Now, this sort of contrast between two close sets of worlds, worlds which collide with each other, which are yet interdependent on each other, and this particular incident that represented a flashpoint in these two worlds coming together made a profound impression on me. Because my previous research had been in the Narmada Valley in central India, the site of struggles over by a large dam. You see here the Sardar Sarovar project, as well as struggles over forestry projects and the more gradual but nonetheless compelling processes of impoverishment due to insecure land tenure. In the Narmada Valley, I'd seen only too often state violence that tried to crush the aspirations of poor people striving to craft dignity with basic subsistence. And now I was watching a similar contestation over space unfold in my own backyard. Now my attention was directed towards how, in an urban context, the varied meanings at stake in struggles over the environment were negotiated through different kinds of projects and practices. And these concerns grew stronger as I witnessed two sets of processes, each an extraordinarily powerful attempt to remake the urban landscape of Delhi at the turn of the century. Through a series of court orders, the Supreme Court initiated the closure of all polluting and non-conforming industries in the city, throwing out of work an estimated 2 million people employed in and around 98,000 industrial units. same time, the Delhi High Court ordered the removal and relocation of all Jhuggi squatter settlements on public lands, an order that would demolish the homes of more than 3 million people. In a city that had at that time about 12 million people, the enormity of these changes was mind-boggling. Both these processes, the closure of the factories as well as the demolition of squatter settlements, was set in motion by the filing of public interest litigation by environmentalists and consumer rights groups. And this particular kind of judicial initiative indicated that bourgeois environmentalism had emerged as an organized force in Delhi, and that upper class concerns around aesthetics, leisure, safety, and health had come to significantly shape the disposition of urban spaces. So as I tried to make sense of these changes in the city in which I'd lived since birth, I found that there was a Delhi I knew nothing about. Even though Ashok Vihar was close to my home in North Delhi, I'd never gone into its Jhuggi bastis or the industrial area adjoining it. Geographical proximity did not translate into social familiarity. How my taken for granted sense of Delhi was disrupted, my privilege as a well-off resident, when I started exploring the bastis and factories and other urban places beyond the bourgeois gaze. And that's when I realized just how segregated Delhi was. When I delved into the history of urban planning, I discovered that while this spatial configuration was a product of deliberate design, guided, however, by benevolent intent, its inherent biases, the biases of the planning process, led to perverse outcomes. In Jhuggi bastis with their open drains and filthy latrines, I came to realize that spatial segregation also created an apartheid of the imagination. Even though the majority of Delhi's citizens lived in such settlements, well-off sections of the urban population simply didn't see or care about them. Despite the dense fabric of daily economic transactions that brought them into contact with domestic workers, security guards, courier delivery men, sales assistants, and restaurant staff, Delhi's upper classes remained socially incurious and spatially oblivious to where and how the working classes lived. Unless, of course, Jhuggi Basti got up their nose and obtruded on their sense of urban order. Then they moved the courts, petitioning for the summary eviction of working class settlements, their actions further intensifying the persistent contradictions between a shared economy of work and a segregated ecology of shelter. Contradictions between capitalist accumulation and social reproduction. So as cities have overtaken the countryside as habitat for most of humanity, the question of their ecological capacity to sustain lives worth living has become all the more critical. Yet, when we listen closely to debates about city planning and governance and carefully observe urban environmental campaigns, we notice that they often have little to do with either ecology or justice. The terms of the discourse, what is an environmental issue? Who is authorized to speak? Which modes of action count as legitimate? These terms are partial, particularistic, and perverse. Why is this so? So in my book, I make three arguments. One, that the power to define and deal with an issue as an environmental problem is unequally distributed. Social location and cultural capital shape interpretive frameworks and capacities to act. Economic and political inequality has led to selective and superficial framings of environmental issues. Second, the urban environment poses a peculiar perceptual problem because it doesn't seem to be composed of commonly understood features of what we call nature. So the predominantly artifactual aspect of the urban environment, the fact that around us is a built environment, complicates understandings of ecological issues, which so far have mainly been based on the template of rural environments. And third, urban environments have primarily been managed in terms of securing spatial and social order. And this logic continues to dictate environmental choices in the city to the detriment of ecology and justice. And I trace these three arguments across different aspects of the city, um, looking at homes and workplaces, ordinary streets and extraordinary spectacles, looking at Delhi's river, the Yamuna, and the Ridge. And the context for my work is liberalization since the 1990s. So Delhi, like a number of other cities, like Gandhinagar, where you study and probably live, was in fact meant to be a planned city. And a planned city where state monopoly over the regulation of space was meant to promote the public interest. An enlightened state would guide urban growth, molding it to the ideals of a modern city. But these ambitions about spatial and social order were thwarted by internal contradictions that subverted state capacity, that was subverted by internal contradiction that subverted state capacity. And this order was also thwarted by the sheer complexity of the social world that they tried to control. Slums and squatter settlements then flourished, not as violations of the plan, but as its inevitable outcome. Despite this paradox, the planned city idea prevails and provides a fertile ground for imagining, for structuring desire and violence. Bourgeois environmentalists approach the courts to seek decisive action to impose spatial and social order, which is essential to their sense of well-being. Government officials use the plan as a weapon that empowers them to extract rents and to displace people. Instead of being a force for the good, the plan has reproduced the vulnerabilities of migrant workers whose labor keeps the city going. And at the turn of this century, bourgeois environmentalist discourse about air and water pollution invoked the notion of public interest and persuaded judicial authority to shut down factories and firms. So there were a series of sweeping court orders that ended Delhi's life as an industrial city, just when liberalization had opened up the prospect for land to be converted into real estate. Large manufacturing firms stood to gain because they could redevelop their land that their closed down factories stood on, but smaller firms were forced to mobilize to save their businesses. Ultimately, as I described in the book, neither court's directives nor the subsequent process of political bargaining and accommodation in fact served to secure environmental goals. What they did achieve instead was a surge in distress for the city's industrial workers who lost their livelihoods but were not even allowed to represent their concerns before the courts. Seeking what's good for Delhi, but in a manner that silenced and impoverished a substantial section of the city's underclass, shows how bourgeois environmentalists added epistemic violence to the structural violence of the plan. This goes back to who is authorized to speak for the environment. In this case, workers clearly were judged by the courts to not be thus authorized. A section of the book, quite a large section of the book, talks about what this idea of public interest focuses on, namely the notion of a public sphere that the city is supposed to represent. In the book, I look at how streets and are form of the urban commons as an embodied public sphere, inhabited and used by walkers, vendors, cows, dogs, cars, bicycles, buses, and so on. And I look at the way in which there have been attempts to remake this embodied public sphere, that is the street, through all kinds of ongoing processes, but also through spectacular events like the Commonwealth Games, which are ways of pushing through at great speed the idea of the world-class city, where international concerns about international prestige, anxieties about international prestige come together with nationalist sentiments. And these are mobilized to push through colossally costly projects. And these are grand opportunities for making money. But in the book, besides that, I also describe how this aspiring world-class city deals with anachronistic elements like cows and cycle rickshaws in the embodied public sphere that is the network of streets. I focus again on bourgeois environmentalism as an initiative to urban order that comes undone because of its failure to comprehend and come to grips with the complex interdependencies of life in the city. And I show how bourgeois environmental campaigns serve neither ecological nor social justice, but such actions come from elites who choose to ignore how their own consumerist lifestyles, especially their toxic enchantment with personal motor vehicles, motorbikes as well as cars, are disproportionately responsible for environmental harm. So conflicting and contradictory interests and actions create an unruly republic of the streets. Along with this discussion, which is about cows and cycle rickshaws in the city, besides cows, one of the reasons why I was interested in cows in the urban environment was to think about our ability to acknowledge and include the presence of non-living human beings in the city. And when most scholars write about nature in the city, they tend to focus on green areas. But of course, what's really important as well are water bodies, rivers, wetlands, in coastal cities, the ocean and the beachfront. But in the case of Delhi, the Yamuna is really important. And just as I focused on cows as non-human living beings whose presence in the city is an embarrassment that incites bourgeois environmentalists to action, as do, for instance, dogs, street dogs, and pigs. In the book, I look at another non-human entity, though of a rather different order, that has also been targeted for control, namely the river Yamuna. So I look at how the Yamuna floodplain, a neglected so-called non-place populated by low-key working class settlements, actually sort of swam into view as a place of value in the real estate economy following liberalization. Once part of the city's commons, large sections of the floodplain came to be enclosed and excluding those who depended on them the most. And I argue that resistance to the seemingly relentless process of making the floodplain a place of capital accumulation arises not so much from the people who are pushed out by redevelopment, most of whom are much too poor, much too vulnerable to be able to organize, but the resistance to redevelopment comes from the river itself, especially the powerful pulse of its seasonal rhythm. So much of the water flow in the Yamuna is concentrated into 3 months, just during and immediately after the monsoons, where the river reclaims its floodplain. And it's this seasonal annual rhythm, as well as the threat of floods, which has only intensified due to all kinds of changes upstream, but also because of climate change and extreme events like intense rainfall and so on, which mean that in some ways the commodification of the river, of the commons, that is the river's floodplain, is challenged as much by the agency of nature as other parts of the city's commons are in some ways safeguarded by all the unruly elements that characterize the city's working classes and the interdependencies between these working class groups and the services that they provide to other people in the city. And just as efforts to tame the Yamuna must contend with its fluid dynamism, the desire to domesticate another urban common, Delhi's green wilderness, must deal with unruly trees as well as humans. And by the unruly trees, I won't go into the details, but I'm mainly talking about Prosopis juliflora, Vilaiti kikad, which is an invasive species throughout the ridge. And in the book, I describe how the city's green areas and publics have shaped each other, giving rise to new identities, understandings, as well as unexpected alliances. So that, in the case of Mangarbani, an old growth forest in South Delhi, south of Delhi, villagers engulfed by urban sprawl have come together with upper class beneficiaries of that same process of suburban takeover in Gurgaon to fight against the destruction of Mangarbani, this forest. An encounter with wilderness sometimes makes people turn towards environmental activism, as I describe in the book. But on the more mundane terrain of everyday life, the conversion of wilderness into parks has enabled the cultivation of middle-class urban personae. It allows morning walkers to pursue bodily fitness through exercise regimes. So this is the way in which particular social groups are constituted uh, by particular kinds of urban spaces, and in turn, those green spaces too are constituted by these groups. But this is not some sort of a neat and coherent process of mutual constitution, because public spaces take on multiple functions, multiple uses, some of which may not be what was intended. So the kinds of parks that exist in Delhi, where wilderness was cleared in order to create ornamental lawns and shrubbery and so on, these parks now provide privacy to young couples exploring romantic and sexual relationships. So in the book, I argue that the production of urban nature is simultaneously a process of creating new forms of class and age-based I'm going to be very quick about this and not go into the details, but I'm happy to talk at more length during the questions and answers. So these are contrasting yet convergent voices on the urban environment that ask how bourgeois environmentalist discourse might be replaced by other claims to nature, especially by working class citizens. And I conclude by laying out some of the conceptual and organizational challenges to social and ecological justice in the city. So one such strategy for environmental action, as I describe at length in the book, has been to approach the courts to close industries and remove slums in the name of getting rid of air and water pollution. But the outcome of such judicial activism, which is often punitive and paternalistic, rarely matches its intentions. Court orders penalize the wrong people and they push the problem somewhere else, outside Delhi or into the future. So factories are asked to relocate. So you can continue to pollute, but please do so in Rajasthan or Himachal, not in Delhi, where the judges live. Or they penalize the wrong people, as in the case of the Yamuna. Squatters on the floodplain were evicted, even though the problem of pollution in the river was actually sewage that was coming from middle class, upper middle class, so-called developed colonies, untreated sewage. People who have toilets were responsible for polluting the river, not those who live along its banks. So these kinds of orders don't create they also do not create long-term administrative capacities or accountabilities, because the court simply says, do this by the end of the month. And all sorts of administrative officials and scramble to do what the court says, but often with extremely harsh outcomes, and certainly without resolving these long-standing, enduring ecological issues. And most importantly, these kinds of court orders, which bourgeois environmentalists acclaim and want, do not substitute for the difficult work of understanding the dynamics of urban life and shaping them through a democratic dialogue about the city. Another kind of solution that is more and more promoted, especially by the government, is smart cities, that we can use information technologies to try and understand better what these processes are, and we can design better systems. So if the judicial process of shaping the city is deeply flawed, so is the faith that administrators place in techno-managerial fixes of the smart city kind. Despite the launch of the Smart Cities mission in 2015, the term still remains ambiguous. Analysts point out that making cities smart seems to chiefly focus on improving what they call efficiency rather than equity by employing corporate consultants to offer solutions based on information technologies. And many of these smart cities solutions are heavily weighted towards securitization and the surveillance of populations. All kinds of apps, Delhi, CCTV cameras everywhere. And these are designed to sideline the question of democratic accountability. So such solutions, so-called to urban problems, demand much closer, more critical has been the case so far. And while they certainly offer new opportunities for profiteering at public expense, their much hyped potential to improve the urban environment still remains unknown. The third kind of solution that's often offered by a number of activists and urban planners, especially more progressive ones, is that one should legalize the informal city. This has also been called occupancy urbanism, in the words of Solly Benjamin. So against the this sort of top-heavy technique of urban governance, which is espoused both by ideas of the smart city as well as by bourgeois environmentalist judicial activism, some scholars propose a radical rethinking of how cities should be organized and run. So they point out that cities in the global south have conspicuously failed to conform to master plans. While the governments of newly independent nation states imported models of urban design from affluent industrial countries, they failed to accommodate local political, economic, and cultural forms. So this mismatch has led to the proliferation of unintended cities, where people left out of plans have made their own arrangements, cobbling together homes and workplaces materials available to them, like the squatter settlements on the Yamuna floodplain. And these informal dwellings are easier to afford and can better accommodate people's specific needs and styles of working and living. They embody ingenuity, jugaad, and entrepreneurial energy. They wrest control over land and housing from the state into the hands of the poor. Their only handicap is the fact that they happen to be illegal. Squatters, vendors on city streets, etc. So these scholars and activists argue that if you give formal recognition to such informal practices, such squatter bastis could be the basis for a democratic process of city making from below. Now, this is, I think, a beguiling argument, and it appeals on populist as well as pragmatic grounds. It suggests that informality is not only the signature of cities in the global south, but also their strength. Rather than unsuccessfully trying to stamp it out, government should support such efforts at self-provisioning, trusting people's innate to devise solutions that work best for them. But this celebration of jugaad, innovative fixes that make the most out of scarce resources, I think makes a virtue out of wretched necessity. Legalizing such settlements would indeed remove the stigma that of criminality and the burden of uncertainty that working class people labor under. And there is no doubt that such crippling conditions of existence must be done away with. But such a reprieve runs the risk of consigning the city's working class to a second class life. There is a double standard at work when those who are privileged to live in formal, well appointed neighborhoods advocate the perpetuation of substandard dwellings in the name of poor people's rights. So, legal settlements, legal working class settlements, where in the case of a fire, you can't actually take a fire engine in because the streets won't allow it, or the fact that there are no drains and there are only community taps. All of these things then continue as before if one only legalizes what is already there. But more important, not more important, but equally important, when it comes to the urban environment, advocacy of informality avoids an important issue. The ecological question demands that we not only think of human populations as heterogeneous and shaped by social hierarchies that empower and constrain, but that we keep in mind our obligations to future generations and to other living beings. An ecological vision that represents these principles and applies them to the complexity of urban life is unlikely to emerge from any one social group. It requires vigorous debate and sustained collaboration between different citizens, administrators, and experts to move cities towards environmental sustainability. Problems like solid waste management can't be solved by any one working by one group alone. Certainly not only by the working class, which is primarily responsible for doing this important job in the city. And I use that as an example to say that all kinds of urban sectoral problems throw up these complex challenges, which require multiple groups of people, experts, administrators, people who are involved in this work to come together. And I went on to say that environmental issues in particular, further complicate how we think act on these kinds of issues, because the environment means championing social justice in the present, but yet doing so without sacrificing the causes of those without voice. So the claim to speak for future generations and non-human species has so far been the prerogative of bourgeois environmentalists who've stood by and actually shrugged at the denial of rights and displacement of poorer people that their actions have precipitated. So when environmentalists say, oh, we need to protect the tiger, they claim to speak for nature, but they certainly don't take into account the fact that poor villagers are displaced when you establish protected areas and throw forest dwellers out. So also with, as I talk about in the book, the idea of cleaning up the city in terms of air pollution, in terms of green areas, or in terms of water pollution. So taking away from bourgeois environmentalists their claimed privilege of speaking for the future and speaking for nature can only be done with new alliances that spark new ways of thinking. And such a comprehensive re-examination of the ecological question requires social relations be challenged. So respecting the cultural logic of informality and recognizing rights to housing is important, but these steps by themselves do not enable wider claims on the city as a whole. They might result in the legalization of a particular basti, but they don't allow the working classes to contest how the urban commons, land, water, green areas, air, are shared and used, managed and transformed. And environmental justice requires a more expansive and inclusive process of decision making, which the grant of housing rights does not guarantee. neither populist policies nor authoritarian diktats have served the cause of ecological justice. So I argue in the book that we need a conversation about the commons that is based on the core criteria of citizenship and civility, and explain what I mean by these. For working class people, informal ways of city making have been essential for their survival. But they're keenly aware that such weapons of the weak are no substitute for substantive forms of citizenship. Trying to stay below the radar of state surveillance, as described by scholars of political society like Partha Chatterjee, the urban poor and propertyless also strive to be recognized, investing tremendous energy into securing the legal titles and formal documents that will allow them entry into civil society. They realize that being denied citizenship is also a form of discursive disenfranchisement because their priorities and concerns are left out and regarded as illegitimate by those with the power to determine what the city should be. The struggle to gain the substantive rights due to all citizens is one of the hardest there is. But the route to ecological justice doesn't have any shortcuts. Securing citizenship also requires making claims upon the state to uphold the constitution, the foremost covenant of independent India. As Baba Sahib Ambedkar had pointed out, the deeply illiberal values of Indian society need a strong state to intervene on the side of equality and justice. But what does one do when the state itself promotes and protects illiberal practices? As the book shows in great detail, the role of the state in urban environmental politics has generally been pernicious. Governments have been committed to facilitating capital accumulation in the name of world-class city making. They've privatized public lands and displaced the poor. They've allowed bourgeois environmentalists to hijack the principle of public interest, which is in fact the first prerogative of an elected government from which its claim to legitimacy derives. Instead of working to secure citizenship for all citizens, the state has generally colluded in the reproduction of inequality. Unlike small farmers and laborers in rural India facing displacement from large dams or mining projects and other state-backed modes of land alienation, the urban proletariat in Delhi has not been able to come together and claim its rights to the city. Their collective agency has been fractured by state policies of recognition that divide and deny. Despite this handicap, they've mobilized electorally to vote for parties that promise patronage and protection, like the Aam Aadmi Party, and they've adopted more personalized avenues of upward mobility, seeking respect through consumer citizenship, which is something I discussed in my other work on instant processed foods, which I won't go into now. Ultimately, the environmental politics of the city is anchored in the quest for substantive justice for all, because without it, there can be no social or ecological justice. It's useful, this is my last paragraph, to remind ourselves that the promise of equality and justice was originally thought to be intrinsic to the urban form. The texture of everyday life, woven out of encounters with strangers and interdependencies with those different from oneself, was supposed to generate new solidarities based on the shared experience of being city dwellers. It is ironic that modern cities that were meant to foster freedom from ascribed identities and facilitate new forms of association have in fact grown into ghettos, reinscribing caste relations and violently excluding the poor, powerless, and marginalized and stigmatized. Discussing Ravidas, Tukaram, and other radical bhakti poets, the scholar Gail Omvet noted that their visions of emancipation invoke the city of Begampura, a place with no pain, and also allude to Sundaranagari, the beautiful city, a place of justice and harmony where even the lowly can hold their heads high? How can Indian cities become places where mutual recognition of a shared humanity is not a sort of minor miracle, but a mundane, matter of fact reality? While the ideal of egalitarian sociality rests on the bedrock of citizenship, it also needs sedimented layers of civility. And by that I mean that beyond an exercise of rights mediated and backed by the state, cities must also cultivate citizens who, while acknowledging their differences, can treat each other with respect. This notion of civility goes deeper than the cosmetic courtesies that make social hierarchies slightly less offensive. The affluent college goer who says, "Thank you, bhaiya," to the auto rickshaw driver is being polite, but her words only smoothen the surface of a status quo that is steeped in inequality. This mask of civility is a procedural device that allows people without breaking through the walls that divide them. In a context where what one wears and eats, how one worships and works, is increasingly a flashpoint for conflict, a pragmatic approach that avoids violent confrontations over perceived differences and instead practices the civility of indifference may be a blessing of sorts. But it's nowhere near enough. We need forms of citywide neighborliness where mutual respect, reciprocity, and restraint can bring about radical change by being aligned with democratic principles. In an uncivil city, and the commons can be a model and a metaphor for creating a shared space of politics. To be open and accommodating to the needy and the vulnerable, to the ant and the banyan tree. To stand fast against the bullying of bureaucrats and the encroachment of big business. To believe that the value of something only grows if it is shared. To keep alive the hope that city making can be based on social and ecological justice. So I draw inspiration from the striving citizens and from the protean character of cities themselves. As Raymond Williams wrote in his classic work, The Country and the City, H.G. Wells once said, coming out of a political meeting where they'd been discussing social change, that this great towering city, referring to London, was a measure of the obstacle of how much must be moved if there was to be any change. I have known this feeling, looking up at great buildings that are at the centers of power, but I find I do not say, there is your city, your great bourgeois monument, your towering structure of the still precarious civilization. Or I do not say only that, I say also, this is what men have built, often so magnificently, and is not then everything possible? Indeed, this sense of possibility that is a permanent element of my sense of cities. And Delhi and other cities, I believe, still embody that hope, and that hope also provides a call to action. Thank you.
Thank you, Amita, for the fascinating talk. We will now invite questions from the audience. I think there's a question there in the chat box at the moment. Should I read this out for you? Yeah, I think let me read
this.
Yeah,
please. Yeah.
Yes. From Yash, thank you so much for this enriching and enlightening, albeit disturbing lecture. Did you come across, or can you point to any policy move or movement that was actually successful / fruitful for every parties concerned? Within bracket, the commons, the natural environment, and the invisible poor people embodying them, either from the government or civil society, either in history or now in India or around the globe. That's from Yash.
Thank you, Yash. I know that because I focused on Delhi, a lot of what I described seems, rather gloomy, because that, in fact, is the political context in which we've been living since liberalization and so on. But in the book, at least, I describe when I talk about the this forest in south, just along the Mehrauli-Badarpur border in Delhi, called Mangarbani. There, I describe this rather unusual alliance that has come about between villagers and sort of nature lovers in affluent nature lovers who would have been described as bourgeois environmentalists in nearby Gurgaon. And in that alliance, both sides have learned to alter their perception on why these areas matter. And I think that when there are certain kinds of when there might be an instrumental convergence like this, which then results in people talking to each other, then people's understandings change, and that's how there can be positive action. There has been positive action in the case of Delhi. I also think that the kind of consistent critique that has come about in Delhi, particularly in the around the 2000s, through a coalition of trade unions, um, groups of particular slum dwellers, squatter organizations from particular neighborhoods, as well as some NGOs, a coalition that came to be called Saja Manch, um, put together incredible documentation of the inequities in Delhi's planning process, both in terms of procedure itself as well as of the allocations and the implementation. And that kind of critique, which was widely taken up by the media, etc., I believe that it has played a role in transforming how particular kinds of, especially with a government that claims to be pro-poor, like with the Aam Aadmi Party, I think policy has sort of shifted a bit. So under the AAP regime in Delhi, the kind of evictions that took place during the Congress era and during the earlier BJP times, where large parts of land were cleared and slum dwellers evicted in order to redevelop those lands for real estate, those kinds of projects and that kind of displacement has diminished in the present times. And I see that as a gain, where the working classes have been able to make a difference. Around the world, from Latin America, from South Africa, many instances of governments, investing a lot in social housing and making that a priority, which is something which hasn't happened to that scale in India pretty much anywhere. So I think there are useful examples to be gained from those kinds of struggles and the political processes that led to them. Um, why don't I stop with that one and take some other question?
Yeah, sure. So there's one from Camellia, one of her students. She says, thank you for this presentation. And does Yamuna behave sort of like a fluid boundary indicating space contestation? Because often Jamna Par has been used to describe the backward Delhi occupied by marginal communities.
Yeah, well, that's absolutely right. That earlier Jamna Par was a statement about distance, not just spatial distance, but social distance, in terms of primarily being occupied by these, low-income settlements. A lot of them were resettlement colonies that date back to the emergency, where between 1975 to 77, people were forcibly removed from parts of old Delhi and resettled on the other side. But that also slightly later, around the 1990s, became the place where a lot of middle class, associations were given land quite cheaply, the so-called cooperative group housing schemes. And a number of industries also then developed in the informal settlements, which came up next to the more formal resettlement colonies. So all in all, this particular East Delhi was thought of as, as a neglected area, as, in class terms also, not as a prestigious place to be. But I think two things changed. One was that because of the cheaper housing available in East Delhi, it attracted a lot of migrants. And over time, that the demographic growth of East Delhi has meant that it has become important for political parties to court that area. And in particular, the migrants from eastern, from Bihar as well as eastern UP, the so-called Purvanchali migrants, became numerically important enough to be actually, sort of registered in the political electoral politics as an important constituency to court. Plus, at the same time, from the east, the growth of Noida, which was earlier an industrial area, but then was developed as a prestigious residential locality as well as a commercial area with, shopping malls and so on. I think all of that, which happened in the 2000s, has transformed the idea of Jamna Par to something which now has these pockets of prestigious developments, as well as a politically important set of social groups that must be kept, sort of on side.
Thank you. There's a question from Pawan Kumar. It says the concept of city as a product of capitalism inherently leads to exclusion or decommunization. So in this regard, how do you look at the relationship between commons, urban, and democracy in terms of access to urban product? Can you please suggest ways to communization?
So what I've argued in the book, Pavan, is to say that the direction of capitalism is certainly the commodification of whatever capitalism wants to valorize. So in this particular case, since liberalization, real estate has become important. So the river floodplain becomes real estate. And, I described the way in which the government, not just mediates that project, but actually encourages it and pushes that along. But at the same time, this direction is something which constantly meets with resistance, with friction, to use the anthropologist Anna Singh's word. And that friction, I argue, comes not so much from the kind of organized resistance that I saw, say, in the Narmada Valley, where there was an Andolan to fight against this large dam, and where there was a trade union of Adivasi farmers and workers who fought to gain access to forest land that they cultivated. So actually what interested me in the case of Delhi was that all of these changes were going forth, but how come there was no resistance of a kind that I could identify in the Narmada Valley? Why were there no mobilizations around evictions, around the closure of factories? And therefore, what I argue in the book, based on what I saw, was that the friction or the undermining of the attempt at commodification comes about from two things. One, that urban life, the urban economy with its interdependencies is actually dependent on the labor of the poor being available, and not just being available, but actually being close by, which is why every well-to-do neighborhood in Delhi has a kind of satellite basti from where all the domestic workers, the security guards, the sabzi wala, and everybody, happens to come. So I argue that the resistance may not be something which is an organized mobilization, but is something that comes from the very complexity of urban life itself. Cycle rickshaws continue in the city, even though people want them out because this is not what a world-class city is supposed to have. But they continue because all kinds of people use them, including upper-class people as well. So I argue, one, that that's where the friction or the resistance comes from the very texture of everyday life. And second, I argue that that resistance comes from the natural elements in the city. The fact that however much you might want to, you can't control the river Yamuna. You can't control what happens to certain kinds of green areas when there are invasive species. You can't control what's happening in terms of increasing heat waves and so on. So all of this suggests a somewhat diffuse process by which capitalism is challenged, not in the black and white lines of domination and resistance, but in the ways in which both everyday processes as well as extraordinary events can work to undermine or circumvent what capitalists supported by the state want to achieve. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, Pavan, would you like to say something? I think.
Okay, yeah, I think Pavan said yes. I just wanted to say that, so therefore the waste, which is not to say that there shouldn't be organized resistance, of course there should be. And we can't just hope that nature will somehow always, triumph up, because after all, when nature triumphs, as we see with the pandemic, it causes great distress all around, right? So all kinds of ways by which resistance may come about, not all of them necessarily benign.
So the next question is from Dotana Banerjee. She says, thank you for the very informative and enriching talk. I understand your point about the possibilities of new alliances between working classes, I would call working castes, and the state and cultivating neoliberal citizens' roles in maintaining the cultural logic of informality and legalizing the informal arrangements. But does it not reinforce the caste relations? For example, Dalits continuing to do manual scavenging and cleaning works, and foreclose the possibility of structural critique of the state?
Well, I'm not sure, Dyotana, that it forecloses that possibility, because what I talk about in the book is both the attempt to gain citizenship. And I think while citizenship may be very much a notion that in some ways conforms to the idea of a democratic state, in many ways I think that that's something that do have to use as a resource, especially now when the constitution is being undermined in all kinds of ways. But the other part of what I spoke about was the idea of civility, because in my mind, to my mind, the notion that the state alone is going to, through popular pressure, through mobilization from below, going to bring about some sort of a transformation of everything is just not possible. So if we're dealing with a complex set of relationships between state and civil society, we must therefore deal with the questions of citizenship and civility together. And in fact, it's precisely among Dalit scholars that I find that the idea of civility is most strongly discussed. And there's a recent volume out, which is edited by Suryakant Wagmore and Hugo Goringe, which is about civility in crisis. And it's very interesting that they take up the idea of civility because level, they're engaging with Ambedkarite ideas of Ambedkar as a constitutionalist position, that we're asking for rights within the constitution. But I think it's their sense that that is necessary but not sufficient that leads them to talk about civility and the way in which there are all kinds of relationships which are not, where state mediation is not the most key feature, which need to be transformed. And those kinds of relationships are, in fact, as I said in my talk, meant to in some way be intrinsic to the everyday interactions that take place in urban areas. The idea of the city as freedom is an old modernist idea. It's a progressive idea. We know that that's generally not, that idea has never been realized. But as with the Constitution, which also the promise of the Constitution has never been fully realized. But these are resources that we must work with, even as we realize that they are limited. Does that does that sort of answer what
Yeah, I
you were
think
looking for?
yes. Thank you for your response. There's a question from my colleague, Dr. Nishant Choksi. Nishant, would you like to unmute and ask?
Hi. Yes, thank
Hi.
you very much for your very nice talk, and I'm looking forward to reading the book. So, yeah, a lot of the questions I had have been raised, but then just one question that was lingering in my mind a bit was the idea that if Delhi, like Delhi as a city, or as say a capital city, right, of a nation state, is subject to certain kinds of bureaucratic logics, perhaps, that other cities are not, and scrutiny, legal scrutiny of a kind. And perhaps it's been this way since British times when they came and created Delhi as the capital. So I'm wondering if first of all, if those bureaucratic logics have something to do with the advent of bourgeois environmentalism in Delhi in particular, and whether it's, I know that in certain other cities like in Mumbai, there's been some of this kind of things, but it seems like there's a very different texture in the urban poor in places like Mumbai, Kolkata. And then also I'm wondering if maybe you may have thought about the ideas of small towns, because the big cities, they're subject, I think one person was talking about, they're subject to capital in another way. They're also subject to this trade unionism, a lot of things we talk about with cities, right? But the small towns of or medium-sized towns or something like this, I wonder if that might have a different, perhaps, possibility, or a different kind of maybe, or different problems, perhaps, with this, and considering a lot of the country lives in such places. So yeah, I'm just wondering what your thoughts would be on that.
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, because that you're quite right that the dynamics are quite different. And I'd say that the dynamics of even the metropolitan cities are different because of the different legacies that they embody into, spatial and social legacies, both in terms of their origins, Calcutta, Bombay, Madras being presidency cities with their own particular, colonial forms of rule, which in the case of Delhi was much more recent. It was, only when the capital shifted from Calcutta um, that you find that imperial power written on a specific part of the city. But I think that the difference is also in terms not only of particular city histories, in terms of labor histories, in terms of histories of production. So in Mumbai, for instance, attempts by working class people living in squatter settlements to gain rights have been deeply informed by the history of labor organizing in the city's textile mills. And there are all kinds of partnerships which emerged in Mumbai between squatter settlers associations, NGOs, the government, which were far more progressive than what could even begin to be imagined in Delhi, because Delhi has always had the politics of incorporating its rural areas into the city as the city expanded socially, spatially, but doing so in a way that recreated a kind of patron-client relationship between the state and the pradhans or the headmen of particular villages. So very different political legacies based on histories as primarily, agrarian or industrial cities, financial capital. Bangalore, you see a different kind of history because of its role place where a lot of public sector industrial manufacturing took place and so on, as Janaki Nair points out in her book. So I think you're quite right that these are different histories, but I think that the same sorts of processes of that liberalization has unleashed and legitimized have occurred in all of these large cities, and not just the metros, but even cities like Jaipur or Indore. One sees the same kind of operations at work, and so for Bangalore, which is a state capital, one still finds that you know urban real estate development has happened over wetlands and tanks with devastating consequences for the water table, but also in terms of flooding. Same for Chennai, as Karen Coelho's work quite brilliantly shows. The question of small towns is an interesting one, and I have to confess that I don't think there's enough research on them to allow us to have a sense of what the differences are. Everyone keeps saying, yes, we must study small towns, but there are actually very few studies that look at environmental questions in them, questions of how spatial change happens. There's Anne Gould's book on a small town in Rajasthan called Shiptown, which is very interesting because it's very attentive to environmental change, and but there aren't that many. And I think you're right that the sort of big capital role that one sees at work in the in metropolitan areas may quite likely in smaller cities be played by regional capital. A lot of regional capital which is diversifying out of agriculture into small towns, investing in commercial development, real estate, and so on. I see that happening in Madhya Pradesh, where I still go to to carry out field work. But I don't think that these processes have been looked at in great detail. And I think there's a huge amount of work that needs to be done. And for those people who are research scholars here looking for research topics, this is certainly something to take up. But thanks for bringing that into the conversation.
Thank you, Nishan. I have a question, Amita. Running to the book is this plea for reducing consumption when I was reading it, and that I think in order to bring about an ecological balance. But then consumption is also considered to be employment generating, and which again in turn is linked to questions of equity. But so I suppose the whole employment scenario then will have to be rethought and reimagined. And there, I think the right right for all to use the commons is something that is going to be very useful. But then the commons is already shrunk, given the history of development that we already have. So, how do we address this situation? How can we push? Is it possible to push back that which we already have? How do we create the space where we can, even think about having a different kind of employment projects, and which would be more inclusive and which would be more ecologically, sort of sensitive.
Right. I'm just going to share an article in the in chat, which actually I read yesterday and which speaks to this particular theme. It's by George Morbiot, and I think the question is of reducing consumption which has an ecological footprint, but which doesn't, we consume all sorts of things, like consume all sorts of services as well, which may not have such a large ecological footprint, right? So from the ecological point of view, the question is, what is the materiality of what we consume, and where is it coming from, what sorts of social relations is that material embedded in, and so on. And I think that to expect people to cut down on consumption where there is such a powerful machinery at work to convince us, persuade us to buy all the time, and which especially heats up during this season, right? Just before Diwali, there are all these dhamaka sales, and everybody feels they need to buy a new appliance or new clothes or what have you. There's the idea that consumers will voluntarily give up consumption is, I think, implausible. People who are ecologically conscious and who do try to take individual steps are actually constrained all the time because the systems aren't set up for helping us make those kinds of choices. And I think this is the important point that George Monbiot makes in this essay, that individual steps are a drop in the ocean. If you choose to cycle instead of driving a car, that's not good enough, because what we have to do is challenge that larger system in which most other people are still going to take cars because it is convenient, because it's prestigious, because it lets them travel in a certain amount of comfort and so on. So by focusing on individual actions, often it's particular capitalist firms who are shifting the conversation from accountability for their own accountability and their own responsibility to this is what you can do. And while of course individual actions matter, and we need to feel we're in control of our lives, so we will take a cloth shopping bag instead of using a plastic one. But at the end of the day, the real big environmental destruction is happening through large capitalist firms and the processes that they promote. So unless we're tackling that big battle, things are not going to really change. To your question about employment, I don't actually see consumption as, an environmentally destructive consumption as necessarily promoting employment. In fact, quite the reverse. Because if you're destroying resources, if you're cutting down a forest in order to, lay a road, yes, those people who are working on the roadside, the construction workers, they're earning a little bit of money that very day. But you've stopped a whole stream of ecological benefits that would have flowed over a period of time, and that would have come not only to the ecosystem and other living beings, but also to the forest dwellers who depend on that ecosystem for decades or even longer possibly. So this is the kind of argument that gets used in the name of economic growth, that we need to, I'm using cutting down trees only as a metaphor for the larger process taking place, that we need to cut down trees because there's jobs in cutting down trees and, in sawmills and in making furniture. But basically what you're doing is creating an income stream in the present. But what you're doing is withdrawing your capital. And that makes no kind of sense. I mean, yes, you get, you get to spend some money right now, but you have destroyed the stock of wealth from which you could have gained steady benefits for a longer period.
Thank you, Amita. I think Nishant has another question. Nishant, would you like to go?
Yeah, actually, this question is not related to this talk in particular, but is it okay if I ask that now, or because I guess we're at the end, but it's
yeah. I mean, okay. Go ahead. I don't think there's any other questions.
Okay,
so.
Yeah. So this is actually related to your previous work, because I've actually started a project in the Narmada resettlement sites in Berda district, and so I'm looking at and I'm I'm rereading your book, which I haven't read for many years now, but I just, because you said you keep going there actually, so I'm wondering, because I'm seeing what the effects are of displacement on communities, many from who worked who are living now in these areas, but I'm wondering what you are seeing. I'm curious, after 30 years, especially the effect of, because I still see the effect of the political movement in the way that those people who are resettled have constituted their own identity. It's so linked to the valley still, even though they're in the plains, even the generations who grew up there. So I'm wondering what you are seeing there in the valley on some of your recent visits.
Yeah. So the part of the valley I go to is in Alirajpur district, and these are villages that were right on the banks of the Narmada. And when the river was dammed and the reservoir was formed, many of these villagers just shifted their homes further up the hill slopes. So they're still in the area, but they're not in their original sites, which is further up. And they're mainly cultivating land because their, revenue land, their patta land got submerged. So they're cultivating forest land on the higher slopes, which to which now they've got rights under the Forest Rights Act, but it's fairly hilly land and it's not very productive. So several villages have, members who've gone and settled down in Gujarat, but they still, keep maintaining their links with the people who are in Alirajpur still. And several people were given land in Gujarat, but found that the land was either disputed or was just unproductive. So they've given it up. And so they're still living in around the reservoir. What I found most striking is that uh, earlier people were very far away from the road, and therefore, any kind of travel to the market or to, a government hospital or, anything at all was just really hard. You had to sort of walk a whole day to get to this particular village where I did my fieldwork. Now what's happened is there are motorboats plying up and down the reservoir, which means that people have much more direct access and faster access to markets. So I found one that the extent to which they're interacting with markets in the sense of selling their produce, but also buying things from the market, but also buying, most important, agricultural inputs like fertilizers, synthetic fertilizers. That's really gone up. So the old way of cultivating, which was a kind of, closed ecological loop with farming, animals, goats, draft animals, fields where they had as many as 12 or 16 different crops. That has now gone. And people are cultivating these far more fragile soils, but actually putting a lot more urea in it to grow, 2 or 3 big crops. So for instance, they used to eat sorghum, jwar. Jwar is almost out now. They grow bajra, and in some cases, they take a second crop of wheat because thanks to the panchayats now, there's been a lot of land leveling in some villages. So they're able to take a second crop because water stays in the soil long enough. So diets have changed, agricultural practices have changed. People say that the soil is a lot harder. They say that, things, the old millets, etc., now we don't grow them. We can't grow them, and so on. So actually, agriculturally, there's been, I would say, the turn towards the use of industrial inputs and more intensive, water-intensive agriculture is right now made them prosperous, but it's going to disappear in the next 5-10 years. I mean, that's quite clear because the water regime just won't allow it. So I see those kinds of changes becoming really important. A lot of consumption practices have, Gujarat has become much more the kind of, role model of the kind of agriculture you should do, but also the kind of person you should be. You should be, so people say people in Gujarat are hardworking, they're business minded. And as Adivasis, this is what we need to be. Whereas earlier, um, people would, sort of say, yes, we Adivasis, we're laid back, we're ignorant. But they would often say this and be, quite cool with it, in the sense that there was a sense of, this is who we are as a people. These are our rituals. This is how we celebrate. We drink mahua, we get drunk. But that's what mahua is for. Whereas now the idea of the good person, the good, hardworking, money-saving farmer is something which is become much more prevalent. And ironically, more and more people are now engaged in wage labor because they don't, get enough from their cultivation. And so the ideal of the good, hardworking, prosperous Gujarati farmer the the sort of partidar model, that's harder to achieve. But because people are really impoverished and they're working in Gujarat as agricultural laborers for the most part. Some are also working as construction laborers. But people's ideas of what it means to be successful and prosperous have changed.
Thank you.
Sorry, there's a lot to talk about there. But,
Yeah.
But how interesting that you're working in those villages. Yeah, I'd love to hear more about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so once we start offline classes and all, you can come over to campus. It'll be really nice. And we can also have an interactive session with the students then, right?
That would be fun.
Thank you so much, Amita. I think there are no more questions, and the questions were actually really quite nice, and I could see them really enjoying and participating. So we had a nice dedicated group, all of more or less all of whom participated, and the others listened quite attentively. So I'd like to thank the audience for staying with us till the end, and thank you so much, Amita, for agreeing to come on Dialogues. It was really
Thank you. My pleasure. Thanks very much for inviting me, and thanks everyone for the conversation.